So welcome everyone to this afternoon's training session. This is the first in a series of training sessions hosted by the Victoria County History on researching place-based religious histories beyond the parish church. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Victoria County History, or as it's often known, the VCH is a 125-year-old project to write the history of every place in England from the earliest records to the present day. And since the 1930s, the VCH has been part of the Institute of Historical Research at the University of London, and today is one of the flagship projects of the IHR's Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. As co-general editor of the VCH, working alongside Adam Chapman, who's also here today, I spend a lot of time working with the researchers across England who produce VCH projects and publications, and it is questions raised by these researchers that have inspired this series of training events. So in each VCH publication, as many of you may be aware, there is a section specifically dedicated to the religious history of the area under consideration. And as you might imagine, when the VCH began to be researched and written in the early 20th century, these religious history sections predominantly focused on the history of the parish church. And while work has been done to diversify these histories over the past 125 years, everyone involved in the VCH project is aware that our projects and publications need to better engage with the histories of the full spectrum of religious communities who have and are now meeting and practicing in villages, towns, and cities across England. In response, these series of training events will draw together experts to learn more about how to research place-based religious histories beyond the parish church. And for the first of these training sessions this afternoon, I'm delighted to welcome 5 speakers who are going to share with us their experience and expertise in researching Protestant nonconformity, Judaism, and global majority evangelical communities. Each will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, giving us lots of time for questions at the end. So I'm going to introduce all of the speakers now, and then they will pass on to each other once they have finished. So firstly, representing the Dr. Williams Library of Nonconformity is Dan Rafiki, and then at the end, Hugh Maguire, who's the director of the Dr. Williams Library, is also going to contribute shortly, and they'll introduce Protestant nonconformity and how to research place-based nonconformist communities. Secondly, Tony Kushner, James Parks Professor for the Study of Jewish, Non-Jewish Relations in the Department of History at the University of Southampton, and Karen Robson, Head of Archives and Special Collections at the University of Southampton, will focus on the history of Jewish communities in England. And finally, John Maiden, Senior Lecturer and Head of Religious Studies at the Open University, will introduce us to the histories of global majority evangelical church communities. So Dan, over to you first.
Fabulous, thank you very much. So I'll just load up my PowerPoint. Yes, I've just sent a request to share, thank you. Yes, so we'll just make a start in a second. Just dragging this across. Okay, fabulous. Yes, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Rafiki. So I'm a researcher at the University of California, Los Angeles. But during my doctorate, I worked alongside the Dr. Williams Library. And it's a pleasure to represent them today to talk about the story of British descent. And yes, I'm aware, unfortunately, the PowerPoint is kind of not full screened, and there are some rather complex technical reasons for that. But it should be good in its current form, and I will affix this to the presentation at the end as well, so you can look through in your own time. Yes, so I will start today by offering a broad overview of the dissenting experience and its treatment by historians, paying particular attention to the ways in which memorial narratives can, at points, obscure modern understandings of those labelled dissenters. I will then proceed to highlight a number of prominent source types which offer particularly promising avenues for researching British dissent. Finally, the presentation concludes with an overview of significant archives invaluable for any study of British nonconformity. So yes, beginning then with a brief history of dissent in the British Isles. Historians use the term dissent to refer to a diverse range of religious movements and groups whose origins lie in doctrinal disagreements, which arose during the Protestant Reformation. During the reigns of Edward VI, Elizabeth I, and the early Stuarts, most Protestants, including those hotter sort of Protestants, today sometimes called Puritans, were able to worship within the broad framework of the Anglican Church. The turmoil of the civil wars and the interregnum saw more radical forms of Protestantism embed themselves at the heart of government. Oliver Cromwell, in particular, was of course associated with millenarian tendencies. Under his regime, which imposed only very limited censorship upon Protestants, a range of short-lived and often wonderfully named radical religious movements proliferated, including the Fifth Monarchists, the Ranters, and the Muggletonians. Moving on now to sort of the first great, quote-unquote, sort of epoch, as it were, in dissenting history, which is the Age of Persecution. Upon his return, the newly restored Charles II was eager to end the perceived sectarian and anarchic religious policy of the interregnum. His Acts of Uniformity, signed in 1662, is a crucial foundational moment in our story, marking the emergence of dissenters as a distinctive legal and social category. The Act mandated that all clergy adhere to the Book of Common Prayer in their services and swear allegiance to the 39 Articles of the Anglican Church, terms unacceptable to many who believed the institution required godly reform. Ministers who refused to comply were ejected from their positions, and congregants, especially sympathetic to them, were forced to worship outside the formal aegis of the Church. The Act was part of a broader emerging policy of repression directed towards Protestants deemed critical of Orthodox Anglicanism. Those found guilty of attending illegal religious meetings were subjected to a range of punishment, including fines and, for repeat offenders, imprisonment. This period is helpfully conceived of as a heroic period of resistance in later dissenter memory making, a moment defined by believers' unwavering willingness to risk their own well-being for the sake of religious truth, as well as a flourishing literature of resistance embodied by writers such as John Milton and John Bunyan. Moving on to the second stage here, limited toleration. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution, which saw the accession of a Dutch Calvinist, William of Orange, to the English throne, there was a significant shift in the status of dissenters across the British Isles. At this juncture, nonconformists were granted legal freedom to worship in their own meeting houses, provided they swore an oath of allegiance to the Crown. Though their treatment was generally less severe than that of Catholics, dissenters nonetheless remained second-class citizens in meaningful ways. Charles II's Test Act remained in force, requiring formal assent to Anglican worship and participation in Anglican communion as a prerequisite for holding public office or for attending university in England. As a result, principled dissenters were essentially banned from these spheres. Moreover, members of dissenting communities continued to face varying degrees of social stigma and ostracization across the British Isles. At the same time, this period witnessed the taming of some of the more radical tendencies within dissenting groups. while those such as Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Quakers continued to face discrimination, they nevertheless managed to secure a degree of status and influence across Britain and its expanding empire. Moving on to our third age here then, which is that of full toleration, revivalism, and modern dissent. In the early 19th century, the remaining restrictions upon dissenters were gradually lifted. In 1828, the Test Act was repealed, affording nonconformists the possibility to access public office. Additionally, restrictions on entry to universities in both England and Ireland were progressively removed during the late 18th and 19th centuries. By the mid-19th century, dissenting communities had increasingly become integrated into the British establishment. Evangelical revivalism saw dissenting communities swell during the 19th century. Methodists and Baptists in particular brought energetic religious practice to growing urban and industrial populations. This stands in contrast to the later 20th and early 21st centuries, during which the congregations of many of these British dissenting traditions have experienced a managed decline. Great. So now that I've offered sort of a brief introduction to sort of the contours of dissent in Britain, I think it's helpful to spend some time briefly summarising some of the key groups associated with dissent. Theoretically, the term dissent can refer to any Protestant in the British Isles, and indeed the broader Anglosphere who objects to Anglicanism. And it thus encompasses a wide variety of forms and expressions. We can nonetheless identify a number of major dissenting movements, which are summarised in the chart here. This chart is, of course, far from exhaustive, but it should provide a helpful reference point for highlighting some of the possibilities for broader and local research into nonconformity across the UK. And yes, I will copy this presentation to the chat after I've finished, so don't feel the need to sort of write down every detail here. The most numerically and politically important group of nonconformists are the Presbyterians, inspired by John Calvin's Reformation of Geneva. They advocated for a church structure with no popish vestiges, particularly bishops was a point of contention. This movement first gained place in the British Isles in the 1560s, particularly in Scotland, where it, of course, remains the creed of the national church. Other groups emerging out of doctrinal differences during the Reformation include the Congregationalists, who held that congregations should be able to elect their own ministers, and the Baptists, who objected to the practice of baptizing children. One of the most initially radical dissenting groups were the Quakers. This movement provoked uproar as they first emerged during the 1650s, when they, for example, engaged in the practice of running into churches naked to demonstrate Christian spiritual equality in front of God. This group is associated with beliefs including pacifism, opposition to slavery, and early support for female preaching. Two movements which emerged rather later, somewhat bucking the trend when it comes to the broad chronology I offered above, are the Methodists and the Unitarians. The Methodists are known for their emphasis on the centrality of free will when it comes to salvation and their missionary work. And the Unitarians, conversely, are known for rejecting the Trinity and instead emphasizing the oneness of God. Great. I will now very briefly, just drawing upon some modern some reference points in sort of modern historical writing on Protestant nonconformists, offer some general pointers, which I think would be helpful for anybody approaching this topic. Some of the terms involved can be a little bit misleading, I think, and encourage us to conceive of dissenters in quite a narrow way. Firstly, when it comes to the term dissent itself, it's worth noting that there are some problematic connotations that lurk within this term. First of all, it's easy to conceive of this label as referring to a homogeneous, unified body of religious movements. While there was sometimes collaboration between these groups, most notably the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, who were at times formally allied, it is important to note that dissenters were members of distinct communities possessing their own theological beliefs, practices, and largely separate identities. Other connotations of dissent are worth highlighting here. The term, which emerged during the 17th century, can be read as pejorative, highlighting a certain pig-headedness, if you will. Dissent, furthermore, is a term which can neatly be placed in Whiggish historical narratives, which valorize the defiance of those who imposed the imposition of religious uniformity. Both of these conceptions of the term dissent, while not without any merit, direct us away from important facets of historical subjects' own lives and times. Consider, for example, the continued push of many Presbyterian ministers in the later 17th century for comprehension, which is to say, securing formal re-entry into the Anglican Church. The relationship between dissenters and Anglicans was not necessarily informed by antipathy, and we ought to be wary as well of some of the mythologizing and in some ways rather dramatic sort of connotations embedded in this term. It is important too to think about some of the limitations of sort of taxonomical thinking. It's very kind of, one wants to imagine when sort of presented with the graph above, this kind of neat Linnaean classification of individual dissenters into distinct groups. However, it's important to emphasize that this conceptual approach has its limits when trying to make sense of Protestant nonconformity. The identities of churchgoers, and indeed churches themselves, were often fluid, particularly in the early modern period, sort of affixing a distinct label to a group or individual, such as Quaker, was often the practice of critics rather than believers, a tendency exemplified by the infamous rhetorical firebrand Thomas Edwards in his work Gangreana, in which he compared religious pluralism to a wound requiring removal. And sort of often even fully committed members of these nonconformist groups might identify themselves as saints or brothers, and so would not necessarily perceive themselves to be members of a distinct religious movement in the unifying way that the denominational names above would imply. Furthermore, determining who exactly might be considered a dissenter is in itself a complex issue. For many dissenting congregations, attendance at communion was seen as a marker of full church membership. However, the distinction between those who attended church and those earmarked for salvation, referred to by theologians as a division between the church visible and church invisible, and this alongside the fact that church members could participate in more informal sermons and prayer meetings as well, all highlight that membership could be quite porous and ill-defined when it comes to these dissenting groups. I'll very briefly touch upon Scotland as well. Kind of as I mentioned, the Church of Scotland is, of course, governed according to Presbyterian principles. It's hardly dissent to follow the precepts of one state church, I think it's fair to say. So yes, when applied to Scotland, I think this term dissent remains most useful for contrasting sort of local church sensibilities with those of the English Anglican establishment. Great. Let's move on to think a little bit more about the sources and archives available for those interested in researching dissent. So I'll highlight some of the sources here. There really is a great breadth of what's available, and it varies significantly according to denomination, to the individual church and its history, and the locality. So this is only a very general guide to some of the sources available. Obviously, sort of church archives are an absolutely sort of fundamental source for studying and engaging this topic area. Some of these church records will be found remaining in the individual churches, and others will be found in centrally located archives. One of the most sort of stimulating church records are consistory records, which are obviously generally found in Presbyterian churches, And these offer a very rich summary of decisions pertaining to sort of the governance of a church. And they offer extremely rich and sometimes surprising insights into sort of day-to-day life in a church. Baptismal records are very useful sources too, and can provide a surprisingly rich array of information. So they don't simply, for example, refer to the birth of the individual in question, but they might have sort of parents' professions and details such as that. A stimulating source type as well are poor relief records. So churches are often responsible for providing for their own poor. And these documents provide a really rich platform for trying to understand churches' role as broader social and communal actors taking care of their poor. When it comes to diaries and journals, these are a particularly exciting source type when it comes to nonconformity. Sort of British dissenters are especially associated with the development of autobiographical writing as a literary form. And beyond more famous texts such as that as Bunyan, lots of local texts, often written by ministers, offer extraordinarily rich insight into religious life, practices, and the memorial agenda of communities. Another source type helpful to highlight, I think, are printed sermons. So many sermons, after being given in church, were printed in a slightly altered form. And these documents, alongside theological writings, offer very rich insight into doctrine and the manner it was sometimes adopted for a specific community. Also of particular interest are funeral sermons, which can offer insight into the lives of sort of high-profile individuals associated with a congregation, and again highlight the practice of specific churches. So yes, I will conclude with a brief summary of the key archives for studying the history of dissent in the UK. So a wealth of relevant material can be found in some of the more prominent national archives across the British Isles. So these include the British Library, the National Archives, the Bodleian Library, and sort of the Library of Wales, Scotland, etc. I would also, of course, depending on the content of your study, very strongly recommend looking at local archives too. But yes, when it comes to talking about collections more specifically focused on the history of dissent, the most important archive, I think, is the John Rylands Library in the University of Manchester. And yes, I'll very shortly hand you over to Hugh to talk about the move of the Dr. Williams Library's collections there. But suffice it to say that it will be inheriting the Dr. Williams Library collections, which are historically the preeminent archive of British dissent. And they possess records including church administrative records for Presbyterians and Congregationalists. They have diaries and journals and a wealth of other printed texts and manuscripts. For most Quaker-related questions, Friend's House, just opposite Euston Station in London, is a very good first port of call. Harris Manchester College at the University of Oxford is also has particularly rich holdings in dissent, especially for Unitarianism. And yes, I'll close in highlighting a couple of helpful resources as well for those wanting to study dissent. One source I found especially useful and I keep going back to because there's so much there is the Post-Reformation Digital Library, as there should be a link in the PowerPoint when I put this into the chat. But this has a sort of an extensive wealth of sort of print texts, and there's some really valuable content there. I would also point anyone working on London and its environs to keep an eye on the Mapping Multi-Faith London project, which is focused on locating and researching dissenting and other non-Anglican places of worship across the capital, which I think should be accessible to the public in the medium term. So yes, thank you so much for your time and attention, and we will wrap up the presentation there.
Thank you so much, Dan. Hugh, do you want to share some things about the Dr. Williams Library?
Yes, indeed. Are you able to hear me? I hope so. Can you unmute me at your end? You can, yes?
We can hear you. It's great.
That's
Thanks.
fine. Thank you. I do not have the professionally prepared presentation of my colleague Dan, which is the Thank you for that, Dan. Just a brief word about the background to the Dr. Williams Library. It stems obviously from the dissenting tradition which Dan has set out for you there this afternoon. The library in its origin was very much intended really as a university library of sorts. Dissenting young men, and they were young men, could not, of course, attend Oxford, and they could not graduate from Cambridge. So the library was really envisaged as a place that would replicate the advantages of a university education. So the initial library of some 8,000, 9,000 volumes, located in a building in the city near St. Paul's, was very much intended to provide a breadth of educational insight for the young would-be men of religion. So the library held things on Spanish literature, Latin, Greek, biology as it was understood, maps of the Netherlands, histories of France, so on. It was a very broad-based holding, which we still retain to this day. And then as things changed, it became more a place for the study of the theologies of the dissenting traditions. And so many thousands of men who would be studying for the ministry would avail of the religious-based material held by the library. The library also became then a place to receive the archives of various worthies, various theologians, various ministers. It was, for example, a long time the place where births were registered for those of the dissenting tradition. Those records were all moved to National Archives, I gather, sometime at the last century, if not earlier. So the library continued to grow and grow and grow, a bit like Topsy, until the 2019, when the decision was taken to refurbish. The refurbishment led to a range of economic challenges which the trust couldn't face. And they cut a very long saga short. The trustees decided to close the library on a permanent basis. And we have decided to transfer all of the material to the management of the University of Manchester / John Rylands library. That will, when you add it to the collections held at John Rylands in relation to the Methodist Church of Britain, that will certainly make John Rylands the foremost centre for the study of the dissenting traditions in this country. We will continue to own our collections. We will be funding 2 to 3 staff at John Rylands dedicated to the collection. There'll be a librarian and an archivist. And hopefully with the wider resources of the University of Manchester Library, all their hundreds of staff, we will, for the first time in our history perhaps, have proper lists and catalogues. Dan, as a researcher, will know how very erratic and spasmodic the collection listings are. A lot in the past seemed to me, and I'm not a librarian, I'm not a church historian, I'm an architectural historian, a lot seemed to depend on the whims and the interests of individual directors and librarians. So certain things are well listed, certain things are ignored, certain papers are well cared for, certain things are forgotten. But the library in its unique holding is very broad. It's not just dissent. There's also material on Byzantine art and culture. There's material belonging to George Eliot. There's a range of very interesting material in that collection, some 200,000, 300,000 items. The fact that I say 200,000, 300,000 is in itself indicative of the uncertain nature of what is actually in the collection. But suffice it to say, there were 8 floors of a very large 1840s building in Gordon Square, and every square inch was full of material. And that material will all be transferred to Manchester. It's all currently in storage. And the aspiration is that it will be made accessible, or it will begin to be made accessible again in the beginning of the new academic year in September, October. It won't all happen at once, but it will be happening. Okay, and we hope to fund research positions and bursaries in the coming years to help open up that collection to wider perusal.
Thank you so much, Hugh. And that's wonderful news to hear that it will begin to become accessible so quickly, because I know that for many it has been kind of sad to not be able to get access to the wonderful collection over the last couple of years. So that is great news, and thank you for sharing with us. Thank you so much, Dan, as well. So if you have any questions that are off the top of your head for either Dan or Hugh, please just do put them in the chat, and we will get back to those later. But now I'm going to hand over to Tony first, and then Karen to talk about Judaism.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. So our division of labour is going to be slightly rough, but I'm going to provide a sort of general context and a case study based on Southampton and its Jewish communities, and then Karen is going to give some examples of contemporary collections and where they are. So I'm going to start just before the founding of the VCH with the formation of the Jewish Historical Society of England in 1893. And it's a good starting point in several ways. One, that reflects that Jewish archives are complicated. They cover both the religious and the secular sphere. So one of the things that was rarely discussed in a Jewish Historical Society was religion, but it was a sort of very much looking to explore British Jewish history from medieval times through to readmission in the 17th century, and then slowly moving forwards. And its purpose was to provide a sort of different history that was perhaps being provided, particularly of the medieval period, when contemporary historians tended to present a very negative view of the Jewish community, which was formally expelled in 1290. So the Jewish Historical Society didn't formally start record preservation, but they did publish some of the early synagogue rules and regulations, and were involved also in sort of building conservation. So a very early attempt to destroy the oldest surviving synagogue in London, Bevis Marks, was one of the things they collectively were involved with. The sort of history they produced was somewhat elite, so it tended to be about the institutional history of British Jews, the political history, and not so much the religious history, but they were often involved in making sure that some of the early records, for example, the Great Synagogue and the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, were not destroyed, but we'd have very, very little early, say, 17th century material. It wasn't until the 1950s that Anglo-Jewish Archives was formed out of the Jewish Historical Society with a sort of explicit remit of saving material. The material that was saved, which forms a large chunk of the collection that is now at the University of Southampton, tended to be sort of top-down. There wasn't very much interest in, say, like the ordinary Jew in the street, of immigrant communities. So it presents a slightly warped view of British Jewish history, of the organizations formed to help, inverted commas, the immigrant Jews, rather than from the immigrant Jews' perspective. And by the time the Jewish Historical Society was formed, that community was being transformed by the East European Jewish arrivals, which by 1914 had totaled 250,000 in total population, from, say, 50,000 20 years earlier. So it's a transformed community. So there are some limitations of what was officially collected, but at least an effort was made. I want to use very briefly an example of Southampton, simply to illustrate the potential and some of the challenges. So because I've been based in Southampton for some time, I've been doing sort of local Jewish history on and off. And it led to a sort of book which was looking from the medieval period with Winchester through to Portsmouth in the 18th century, and Southampton, Portsmouth and Bournemouth 19th and 20th century, which published in 2009. The official records were relatively limited for, say, the modern period. So if you take the Southampton Hebrew congregation, it was founded in 1833. So it's one of the oldest communities, founded out of Portsmouth, which was one of the very first beyond London. And those communities tended to be in port towns, Falmouth, Portsmouth, Plymouth, Exeter, and so on. some of them with very strong links to the Navy. Southampton comes out of that. It never totaled more than 250. Today, according to the census, there are 200 plus Jews in the area. According to the two religious communities, Reform and Orthodox, our joint membership is about 70, and at age 64 and 3/4, I'm one of the youngest members officially. So it's an old elderly community, but there are many Jews who are not connected to that community, either of those communities. So it's again, in terms of the religious community, does not necessarily contain even the majority of those who would identify one way or another as Jewish. So there is, in terms of record preservation, I think a typical pattern. Unfortunately, the first minute book, which would have dated from the 1830s through to about the 1870s or 80s, went missing. Now, this was not out of the line thing, it just probably someone borrowed it, it wasn't returned. But it also reflected that there wasn't really a relationship with the local record office. And that was typical, I think, of most provincial Jewish communities until quite recently. It wasn't necessarily any hostility. There was perhaps nervousness of approaching the local Jewish community. But I think in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been much better sort of communications, shared good practice, and a lot of records have gone to local record offices. And that's sort of, if you like, a national strategy. It's not in every place, and there's always the danger when the last secretary keeps hold of the minutes and then they pass on and their children are clearing. That has happened far too many times. There are some communities. So even though we've lost the first minute book, to have the minute books from the 1880s through to present is quite a good thing. So writing the history of Southampton Jewry, the synagogue records are interesting, but relatively limited. It's sometimes amazing what goes on, but which is not recorded. So, for example, I've done a lot of work on a transmigrant camp that was where is now Southampton International Airport, which was the largest transmigrant camp in the world in the 1920s. Several thousand people were stuck there because of immigration control. Majority were East European Jewish from Ukraine. You would hardly know it existed from the synagogue records. And yet you've got several thousand Jews who are living there, marrying there, dying there. They are present in the old Jewish cemetery. So the history of that is going to be found in local archives, health records, American consular records, Jewish organization or national records, and those histories can be recreated from international sources, but actually locally you don't get that much material. So you need to be very adept at sort of thinking where would material be. There are some records in the local city archives, for example, really interesting records relating to the granting of space for in the cemetery. So it's a beautiful Victorian cemetery, and there's a Jewish section of that, which is now historic. There's a new Jewish cemetery a couple of miles away. But that indicate the local records can indicate some of the integration of the local Jewish community. Southampton has sort of fame for being the first Jewish councillor in the UK in 1838. This was sort of in inverted commas illegal. It was not for another 7 years that Jews were allowed to be exempt from a sort of Christian oath in local office, or then a few 10 or so years later in national office as MPs. So we have sort of great pride locally in that, but equally the same person who was elected in 1838, Abraham, as they say about the footballer Loire in Portsmouth, so good they named him twice. Abraham should have he became the sheriff of the town and should have become the mayor, but wasn't, because he became a sort of scapegoat. He was representing the Conservative Party, so the party opposed emancipation, but there's a political scandal vote rigging and buying, and he is sort of implicated, and he goes into exile in Brussels and Paris. So we find out a lot about the place of Jews in Southampton society through the through the national inquiries into this case and so on. So it's sources outside the very specific Jewish archive. But I think what all sort of good Jewish history locally and whatever, and I think the best example of local Jewish history is the work of Bill Williams in Manchester, relies on both the surviving Jewish archive, which in the case of Manchester is rich because efforts were made for its preservation as early as the 1970s, but also very importantly, non-Jewish sources. And I think there's a sort of parallel there with the nonconformist groups we've heard about, and also parallels also because of the diversity of the Jewish community. Even in Southampton, even a community about 30 or 40 in the 1830s, 40s managed to split for some reason we don't quite know about, probably personality, whatever. So this is a dynamic community and increasingly becoming integrated into the local history of Southampton and region. So very recently, the original synagogue site has had a small amount of archaeological excavation, and that has led to a few items, including a bottle of kosher wine. Any of you who've had a bottle of kosher wine know that it is not a wine for drinking. It's appalling, but it's amazingly survived demolition of the site. But it's interesting. There's now going to be a heritage display, so it's a sort of integration of that history into Southampton's wider history. I'll pass on at this stage to Karen, and she'll give some more precise examples of where Jewish archives have ended up and new initiatives as well.
Thanks, Tony. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Okay. Hello. So thanks very much to Tony for his introduction. I'm now going to do a very brief introduction to aspects of the present and emerging picture relating to Jewish archives. It's still the case that many Jewish archives are preserved in publicly funded libraries and archive repositories. The picture is changing with greater plurality in the way that archives are both created and curated as well as presented. Southampton, which holds major Jewish archives, does so in the context of an agreed framework was set up among Jewish UK archives and libraries in the late 1980s to provide a home for Jewish archive material. Southampton focuses on what's broadly described as Anglo-Jewry, whilst the London Archives, which was formerly the London Metropolitan Archives, focuses on London-based organisations. The framework also allows for community archives to stay close to home, finding their way into local record offices, such as Tony's already mentioned, and for national institutions such as the British Library or national libraries, such as the National Library of Wales, to collect material or figures of national significance. Details of material found in these record offices can often be found in their respective archive catalogues, and I have a link here to the catalogue for Southampton, or on collaborative platforms such as the National Archives Discovery Layer, which I shall return to shortly. Just to say, with regard to Southampton's archives, we have somewhere in the region of about 4 million manuscript items over many hundreds of collections. There are often material of organisations, individuals and families, some community-based material. And as Tony has said, the core collections on which these are based was material collected by the Jewish Historical Society of England, which did have quite a sort of elitist focus on those. One of the things that we have been doing in the years since the collections came to Southampton is try to diversify and expand the coverage of those collections to allow a greater diversity of voices to be heard. And that's one of the things you'll find the development of the collections over the last 3+ decades at Southampton. So where else would you look for material and information. Community partnerships is another model for record keeping. The Liverpool Record Office and Merseyside Jewish Community have had a long and successful partnership. Working in collaboration with the Merseyside Jewish Community Archives, a community archivist helped coordinate collecting and encouraged its cataloguing and use, while the Liverpool Record Office provided archival storage and access. Other examples, such as those mentioned here, include the Le Havre Jewish Heritage Project, which is run by Tyne and Weir Archives and Museums and Newcastle Libraries, and Rainbow Jews, an archiving project by the liberal Judaism, with material held at the London Archives, capturing the voices and experiences of Jewish LGBT people in the UK through oral histories and archival creation. Another area to look for is community-generated archives and curated collections. Access to digital resources has enabled communities to create or curate their archives online rather than relying on archives on libraries to hold this material. This has had the impact of empowering a much more diverse and wide range of voices from across the community and made accessible a wealth of information. Examples such as include the Gathering the Voices Association, which is a Scottish volunteer-created archive that documents the lives of men and women who fled to Scotland to escape Nazi persecution, and the Jewish Historical Association of South Wales, which is illustrated here, which documents the cultural heritage of Jewish communities in South Wales. Another area of development within the archive community has been the creation of online collaborative resources, providing descriptions of material. For the UK, leading sources include the National Archives Discovery layer and the Archives Hub, which is funded by JISC. Both of these contain valuable information from a wide range of institutions that would hold interest for the family and local historian. There are also more international coverage. Southampton and London Archives, for instance, both contributed to Eurusha, which is a central platform providing detailed information on European Jewish archival heritage drawn from the European, US, and Israeli academic and heritage institutions. And Southampton is involved with the European Holocaust Research Institute, which, as its name indicates, collects information on Holocaust-related material from across Europe. But probably of most relevance to UK local history is the Hidden Treasures portal. This is a project created under the auspices of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, and now maintained by Rothschild's Foundation Hanadiv Europe. It includes information on a wide range of organisations that hold Jewish archives, but it also, more importantly, has links to various community projects. It is a really useful resource on Jewish archives in the UK, and a number of the organisations whose archives I've mentioned featured in this portal. So that's me finished. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen and Tony. That was wonderful. Great sort of range of sources there. And thank you so much, Tony, for talking about the kind of range of different places that it's necessary to look for these kinds of stories. And I think that's probably true of all of the communities that we're talking about today, that you can't just go and look specifically for the archives of one community. You need to look in lots of different places to references to them. Great. So again, please do put your kind of messages in the chat. Thank you to a few people, Helen and Fran, who've been putting things in the chat so far. Great to see those. So I'm now going to pass over to John Maiden, and I am going to be sharing John's PowerPoint slides. So John will be doing a kind of next slide, please, situation as we go along.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for Ruth and Adam for organising for this event. In 1971, Dr. Clifford Hill a white evangelical congregational minister and a sociologist, published a book about the changing shape of British Christianity. I'm going to quote some of it. He wrote, "While English church leaders have been vainly trying to rally support to prop up the tottering foundations of traditional white Christianity, a quiet revolution has been taking place among Britain's black Christians in the unfashionable back streets of our towns and cities." He referred to this phenomenon as an urban evangelical explosion. And in doing so, Hill was describing arguably the most significant reconfiguration of British Christianity in the second half of the 20th century, of what we refer to in this session as the rise of global majority evangelical churches. In more recent times, various local studies indicate a continued and intensifying trend. For example, a University of Roehampton study, I think about 9-10 years ago, of one prominent constituency of global majority churches, what the researchers termed new black majority churches, identified at least 240 operational congregations in the borough of Southwark, and suspected, without claiming to confirm, that this represented, quote, the greatest concentration of African Christianity in the world outside of Africa. I want to begin this session by saying it's difficult to overstate, therefore, for researchers of the British religious landscape and of religious places and placemaking, the importance of this emergence of these new churches, denominations and networks, usually, though not always, outside of the historic mainline British churches. But research into this area can also bring its own distinctive set of challenges, which I hope to be able to address as part of this talk. So what I'm going to say is divided into 4 parts. Firstly, I'm going to look a bit at terminology and definitions. Secondly, think a little bit about the historical background. Thirdly, identify some research themes, and then finally talk a bit about methods. So next slide, please, Ruth. Okay, so definitions. The publicity for this event referred to global majority evangelical churches. And this is a terminology that seems to have usefulness in terms of encompassing a breadth of churches, which largely represent congregations of heritages, including African, African Caribbean, Southeast Asian, Middle Eastern, and South American. It's important to note that historically, labels used to describe clusters of global majority churches have often been white scholarly definitions. In the case of African and African Caribbean heritage churches, as social scientists began to notice the emergence of these congregations in the 1960s, they often simply referred to them as black churches. Later, the term black-led was used, and after that, black majority churches. The latter has often been utilised by those churches, in part because it had a kind of utility for ecumenical or political engagement. However, within just the African and African Caribbean heritage churches, there is, of course, enormous diversity. And that would include, for example, in the 1960s and 1970s, churches with ties to a particular Caribbean island. Also, there's been significant denominational and theological diversity, so much so that umbrella labels can suggest a homogeneity where there is, denominationally and theologically, often none. Another relevant terminology to this discussion is evangelical. Many of these churches that we're talking about can, I think, be described as evangelical, in that we can trace historic characteristics to the revivals of the transatlantic world of the 18th century and the missionary movements which followed. However, there are 2 important caveats to this. First is around that definition of evangelicalism. The kind of standard, almost kind of widely used definition of evangelicalism is David Bebbington's. And he talks about evangelicals as biblicist, crucicentric, so an emphasis on the cross, conversionist, and activist. These characteristics are often evident in global majority evangelical churches, but a fifth characteristic usually is equally prevalent. And this, I think, speaks to the influence of Pentecostalism in the global south, and that is emphasis on the Holy Spirit. A second caveat would be that evangelical is that some of the global majority evangelical churches have been significantly influenced by indigenous cosmologies and practices in countries of origin. That would mean they are in some ways very different to the 18th century transatlantic evangelical revivalism in some beliefs and practices. We can also think of these churches in relation to dissent and nonconformity. So it's really good to have, I think, a chance to talk about this following the first paper. The images on the slide here are an example of this kind of connection running through the built environment. This is of what was Platt Chapel, Rusholme, in central Manchester, a Unitarian chapel from the 18th century. Then became, it was kind of various kinds of sacred spaces, the Manchester Amateur Photography Society, a live music venue, and is now owned by the Redeemed Christian Church of God, and is known as the Grateful Church. And this, the Redeemed Christian Church of God, are a black majority church, and with particular links to Nigeria. Writing in 1979, John Root, the chair of the Evangelical Race Relations Group, recognised comparisons between what he called the black-led churches and the resurgence of evangelical nonconformity from the mid-18th century. For example, in their growth, sometimes through separation out from other churches, as in the case of Methodism, in their search for church buildings, but also in being what Root called a church of the people. Like the 19th century nonconformists, Root argued that the black-led churches equipped individuals with skills in organisation and leadership, and with an important voluntary organisation in that respect. Another interesting terminology used in relation to these churches has been the idea of a new nonconformity. And I think this can be quite useful in terms of situating the emergence of global South majority evangelical churches within the longer historical story of British Christianity. Indeed, if you look at some of the appellations of these emerging congregations, say in the 1960s, names like Zion, Rehoboth, Bethel, Shiloh, these are often echoing some of the names of the historic dissenting landscape. A final point on definitions and terminology is that we should not overlook the fact that there are global majority evangelical churches within the historic UK churches. So you will find Baptist evangelical churches, Anglican evangelical churches that are global majority churches and parishes. But usually in this paper, I'm talking about, and I'm not talking about those churches. Okay, next slide, please, Ruth. So let's think a bit about the historical background and stand back for a moment and think about some of the reasons for the emergence of growth of global majority evangelical churches in the UK. I've only time to kind of point towards some kind of common general factors here, often a coming together of different factors. First was the experience of white Christian prejudice. It's important to remember in the case of the post Windrush immigration from the Caribbean, that many migrants had been members of Anglican, Methodist, Baptist churches in their countries of origin. That very often, though, their experience of what they sometimes thought of as the mother church in the UK was not good. Experiences could range from that of kind of racist hostility, to a certain coolness or thoughtlessness or inflexibility, which, with whether deliberate or unintended, had the same negative impact. These experiences were evident in the biographical reminiscences of Philip Mohabir, a Pentecostal missionary who came from Guyana to London in 1956. And in his autobiography, he describes the streets and marketplaces of Brixton and black immigrants, I quote, like sheep, distressed, weary, and downcast, and without a shepherd. Men and women who would, quote, come up and introduce themselves in tears, telling me how they were starved for real Christian warmth and fellowship. And, quote, with many recalling, quote, unpleasant experiences in the white churches. Another factor was the migration of existing Christian traditions. Migrants from the global south had often brought with them their commitments to particular expressions of evangelical tradition, denominations, networks from countries of origin. The third factor has been mission. Some of the earliest leaders of African Caribbean churches in the UK arrived in order to share the gospel. The Pilgrim Wesleyan Holiness Church, for example, was established in Birmingham in 1959 after Dennis Sampson came from Antigua specifically in order to share the gospel. In recent decades, increasingly a phenomenon of what some scholars call reverse mission has been identified, and that is churches based in the global south sending church planters and missionaries to the UK to evangelize both particular diasporas but also the wider UK population. And I think it's probably helpful to try to periodize the growth of global majority evangelical churches in the UK. So in the pre-1950s, you have a few examples of global majority evangelical churches in larger cities. Examples would include a church in Peckham, established by a Gold Coast businessman, Thomas Brem Wilson, in 1908. Or in Liverpool, Daniel E. Cart opened an African churches mission in 1922, largely serving sailors, which by 1936 had 558 members. In the 1950s to the 1970s, you have significant growth in the form of African Caribbean and African churches. And this is the kind of urban evangelical explosion, which our Congregationalist minister, I quoted him at the beginning of the talk as speaking about. These were largely made up of Pentecostal and holiness churches with connections to the Caribbean, but also African instituted churches, or AICs. Initially, in particular, those serving West African business people and students. A number of them were in the Aladura or praying people tradition of Christianity. Churches like Church of the Lord, Aladura, which opened its London branch in 1964, the Cherubim and Seraphim, which opened its London branch in 1965. As an indication of the growth of these churches, I've included a quote here from an early 1980s funding appeal for the Centre for Black and White Christian Partnership, a theological training initiative, which opened in 1978. And I read from it. It is sometimes said, what we need in this country is a Christian revival. The fact is, there is a revival going on under our noses without us recognizing it. Over 700 churches have been established by our African and West Indian Christian brothers, over 120 in the Birmingham area alone. Some of them have an African tradition, others a holiness tradition. The majority have a West Indian Pentecostal tradition. So significant numbers there being described in that source. And then we have a third phase of what you might call neo-Pentecostal and charismatic churches. These are churches, a newer cluster of churches, which are the result of the kind of changing landscape of Christianity in the global south, including from sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Latin America. These are often highly networked and well-organized networks, often with very effective use of social media. Examples would include the Redeemed Christian Church of God and Winners Chapel from that are Nigerian-based churches, or the Forward in Faith International Ministries, which is based in Southern Africa. And in some cases, churches and networks have been founded in the UK by men and women of a migrant background. An example would be Kingsway International Christian Centre, which has its HQ in London. Next slide, please, Ruth. Okay, let's think about some research themes. What are the kinds of things that you might be interested in? Number one, I think placemaking is an important theme. Like many earlier nonconformist groups, but also like many migrant religious groups, Jewish, Muslim, and others, an important theme has been the search for places of worship and community. Many of the early African Caribbean churches were bedsit gatherings. In the 1960s, it was common for congregations to seek either to hire or to purchase the sanctuaries and halls of the mainline historic UK churches. As Colin Winter, the exiled Anglican Bishop of Namibia, reported of Lewisham in 1977, and I quote, "Church life is characterised by struggling denominations with a number of well-attended, lively black churches, often using the same buildings, but rarely meeting." And this search for premises could involve frequent movement between venues. So, for example, the Shiloh United Church of Christ Apostolic in Croydon was described by its leader, Bishop Malachi Ramsey, as having been since 1968 a, quote, travelling congregation, moving between a church hall, a TOC-H centre, a school hall, an Anglican church hall for mornings, and then an Anglican church sanctuary for the evenings. And then in 1976, only 8 years later, a derelict property found for them by the council. And increasingly, the neo-Pentecostal and charismatic churches have sought out old commercial premises, shop buildings, industrial buildings, even cinemas or bingo halls. Second research theme would be supporting diasporic communities. Like many religious-based groups, global majority evangelical churches make an important contribution often to what we might refer to as social capital. That is, through activities such as youth work, adult education, care for the elderly, a whole range of social activities around, say, employment, poverty, healthcare, migration, and citizenship. And a third theme would be the stories of these communities. Global South majority evangelical churches have often been the most important voluntary organisation within diasporic communities, centres of community life, and centres of, for example, political leadership and political and social organisation. Okay, finally, research methods. Next slide, please, Ruth. A challenge in researching some global majority evangelical churches is undoubtedly sources. So in the early 2010s, I was involved in an Arts and Humanities Research Council project called Building on History, Religion in London. And one of the difficulties which we identified working with various church leaders and historians was around primary source material. Congregations are sometimes not as well documented by textual sources as some of the historic mainline UK denominations. Another challenge has been that in many cases, individual congregations may have moved quite frequently. So what are the available sources? Well, oral histories are particularly important. Indeed, I'd say they're vital. And I'd say that researching the history of congregations established from the 1960s to the 1970s is now particularly urgent because of the age of the pioneering generation who often founded or planted those churches. So oral history is an important activity for the researcher. I'm happy to ask questions about that later. Answer questions, rather. Websites and social media. Many churches are particularly effective in using these digital resources, and this can be one way of building up the picture of a congregation now, or a sense of its story. Thirdly, sources relating to planning permission can be quite helpful, and so that's sources held by the council, or planning permission sources held by consultants. They can be very helpful about picking up, in terms of kind of picking up some of the details around placemaking. Also, and these are not sources that I've used, but my guess is that charity commission sources might be quite helpful as well. Sorry, I'm going to have to cough again. And then a number of additional sources that I think can be quite helpful for researching global majority evangelical congregations. The first would be the British Council of Churches archives, which were held in Bermondsey and are now at Lambeth Palace Library. Interestingly, it was the BCC and not the Evangelical Alliance that coordinated a number of the kind of early initiatives bringing together white and global majority evangelical leaders, and with various initiatives and committees which looked at, for example, issues around the sale or hire of church buildings. So there's quite a lot there at Lambeth, which will give you a sense of some of the general issues around buildings and sale and hire of buildings, but also some specific cases as well of particular congregations who've been through that process. Then there's the work of Roswith Gerloff, a German-born researcher who did her PhD pioneering research on what she called the Black Lead churches in the 1970s. And she released a two-volume book called A Plea for Black British Theologies, which is an incredibly detailed survey, really, of the background, tradition, ecclesiology, and various other aspects of global majority evangelical churches in the UK. I mean, this was pioneering research. And so you can get hold of those two volumes. I think they're essential, actually, for this topic. But also that her primary sources are held by the New Testament Church of God. They have their HQ in Northampton. They also have a kind of teaching centre and archive there. And it could be worth contacting them and thinking about using some of those primary resources. Another important source is the University of Roehampton project report, Being Built Together. Now, this was the project that I referred to at the beginning of the talk, which investigated the number, places, and priorities of what it called new black majority churches in the borough of Southwark over 2011 to 2013. That's a really kind of helpful, kind of exemplar report on global majority evangelical churches in a particular area, and that I think could be very helpful. Finally, there are a number of edited collections by a researcher called David Goodhue, on essentially on church growth in Britain in the second half of the 20th century. And these there are a number of volumes, and these include some really helpful chapters on global majority evangelical churches, which I think would provide kind of more useful background for those researching them. Okay, I'll leave it there. I'll just conclude by reiterating, I think, the importance of these churches and networks in a reconfiguration of British religion in the 20th and 21st century, a period in which Christianity has been both declining and growing. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much there, John, and so much that you've kind of opened out in terms of being able to ask questions more generally of all of today's speakers, particularly around that process of placemaking and the ways in which the built environment has been passed through the hands of many generations of different religious communities. So now is time for questions and discussions. There are various comments. Thank you so much to people who have added comments in the chat with kind of their experiences of lots of different sources that could be used for some of this research. And Helen Shields has also highlighted the Society for One Place Studies, which might be of interest to some of you who are studying particular locations and local sites. So if anyone has any particular questions, now is the time to put it in the chat or to raise your hands. But while I let you think about those, I'll sort of take the chair's prerogative and ask a question about all of you sort of mentioned this process of finding sources that are not necessarily related to the church communities that you're researching. And I just wondered if each of you kind of had a bit of an example, maybe, you know, Tony, if you're talking about the transient site in Southampton that you've done some work on, in terms of how did you start that process of finding those sources? And John, in particular, I'd be interested to hear how you built relationships with communities to be able to do some of these oral history work. I don't know who'd like to start. Tony, you've unmuted yourself. Would you like to start?
Okay. I'll give an example of work that I thought was impossible to do, partly as well. Those of you that came in normal time will realise I'm not the technical genius that you might think I am. But it relates to the old Jewish cemetery in Southampton, and there's a remarkable, small, very simple gravestone for a 2-year-old who was both born and died in this transit camp. He died of a minor infection, and so his short life, very tragically, was confined within this space. What is unusual about this tiny little gravestone is that there was a space in it for a photograph. Now, in Jewish tradition, you don't have photographic imagery in your gravestones. That's sort of against all tradition and religious sort of practice. And I've done tours around the old Jewish cemetery and sort of often said, well, we will never know what this little boy looked like. I've been working with someone who is a local journalist and reporter who has found hundreds of the descendants of the people who were in that transit camp and found archival records, photographic records. And this young child, Boris Selesnov, he has found the descendants of that family and has found the photograph that almost certainly was in that gravestone. So as a sort of act of, although it's sort of against the tradition, there are other tombstones, gravestones in that Jewish cemetery which have these ghostly photographs. And what I'm hoping to do is sort of reunite that photograph with the gravestone. So I think the internet and genealogical sources have been just phenomenal for doing sort of history from below of migration. Sources that would have taken incredibly detailed work and luck to find people. Now the luck element is disappearing, and because some of the things I've written about this camp have been digitized, descendants have contacted me as well, making my life a lot easier. So I think it's, these are not records that are kept in organizational files. Some of them will be in Congress files in Washington, America, but rarely will you get these individual stories. And I think that's another aspect of the sort of democratic nature of the archive now, where you can start to do really imaginative recreations and find stories that would have been lost, and I assumed had been lost forever.
Wow, that's amazing to be able to find those kind of really personal stories that have been kind of preserved in some way in a kind of physical environment, but to be able to then trace it back to the individual. Thank you so much. John, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll speak a bit about the oral histories and I suppose kind of more generally experience of researching kind of newer Pentecostal or charismatic churches, some of them global majority, others not global majority. I think in each case, it's important to find the gatekeepers who are able to, who have a sense of the kind of the history of the community and the organization, or the organization, and to establish a rapport and to establish trust, so they know you're kind of a genuine researcher, you've got kind of genuine aims and interests, and I think once you do that, I've found that it's usually quite easy to be put in touch with the right people. People are usually very happy to talk about reminiscences of and their kind of experiences. And actually, once one or two people have spoken to you, other people will tend to come forward. So it's kind of it's making the kind of initial kind of inroad, I suppose, and then you tend to find that all kinds of opportunities come forward to talk to people. I'd say as well that to do all you can for it to kind of be a kind of co-production of knowledge as well. So particularly in talking to people who perhaps have a stronger sense of the history of a particular community or a church, to be asking them about the kinds of things that you should be interested in. What do I need to know about this church? Certainly not to kind of go in thinking that you with a kind of inflexible agenda, but actually to see it as something that you're kind of co-creating, that can be really helpful as well. Yes, there you go.
Thank you so much, John. And in terms of finding the gatekeepers in the first place, how have you gone about doing that?
I wouldn't. There isn't a kind of there isn't a kind of a process that will always work. It's really just, I suppose, using the web, trying to make initial. I mean, often it would be a case of approaching a minister or an administrator, and going in that way, or trying to find kind of through others, kind of people that in common. That kind of networking is the way to do it. But there's no kind of straightforward way that always works. It's really just kind of using your kind of initiative, really, and your kind of intuition. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Dan, is there anything that you'd like to contribute to this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in some ways my perspective, as shall we say, somebody who focuses more on the early modern period in my own research, means that in some ways, I think it's really interesting to hear some of the different approaches, I suppose, to research that we've had from the different speakers. But I guess maybe what I'd emphasize as valuable in this instance is, I guess, kind of thinking expansively about what's in archives and how they can be used. I mean, in one sense, this is simply the fact that what we find in archives goes far beyond what you might imagine. As Hugh demonstrated quite well, the contents of the Dr. Williams Library are actually very expansive and go well beyond sort of the theological texts that are often imagined. And I think, I mean, one thing I would always say is sort of, be friends with your library catalogue, like really get in there and kind of look through sources and go out of your comfort zone with what you get. I've certainly found in my experience, sort of just kind of getting texts when I don't really know what they are, or even if they're related, has actually been very beneficial. It's kind of given me new perspectives on the research at hand. So yeah, I suppose what I'm saying in a way is, I mean, we all have different approaches, and I think this is an approach that works perhaps best or better in the early modern period, sort of really being archive-led and sort of just kind of seeing what material is there and then sort of building your research around that is something I found very rewarding personally.
Great, thank you very much. Karen, as an archivist, is there anything you'd like to encourage us to be doing when we're trying to find these questions about religious groups in particular locations?
Gosh, that's a big question. I mean, in some ways, if we're thinking of the Jewish archives, there may be some specific sources that you will go to immediately, but if you're thinking about material about a community, you are going to find it in all sorts of sources. I'm just thinking of some of the collections we have here, just because it's a collection of an individual, they live in a community, they're involved with their community. That may be an involvement in all sorts of ways, but it will tell you a lot about what's going on in a particular place, their interaction, possibly, lots of people are involved in all sorts of organizations. So it could be welfare, it could be social, it could be interfaith, could tell you a lot about interactions outside the Jewish community as well. So I think it's just being open to try all sorts of sources and think about all sorts of ways into finding information about a particular place, I think. But talking about the oral history, I mean, that is increasingly a way that information is gathered about more local, more recent communities or more recent events. And it's been a way, I mean, I was mentioning sort of community curated or community created archives, and that to a certain extent has been driven by things like the development of technology, the ways you can instantly you can create a website or an online resource quite easily, but also things like people wanting to reminisce and keep their stories for, or curate their stories for the future. And oral histories have been the sort of bedrock of quite a lot of these communities, and very important to get a whole diverse range of voices.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I suppose at this point I should reveal myself as a sort of specialist in Methodist history myself, and to kind of add to some of the things that have been said, that there's actually a real opportunity I have found when working with communities who don't have the same legal obligation as the Church of England to deposit their archives in local archives, to work creatively with the archives that they themselves have curated and kept. So whether that's what you find in a box in a basement of a church, which they're quite happy for you to use in all kinds of ways, and it's much easier to get the community to look at and read and respond to than if you have to take the community into the archives, or whether it's the fact that that community has kind of crowdsourced an archive, as Karen's sort of been talking about, and that means that you get something that's kind of representative of the people in that community rather than the institutions of that community. So it can be very exciting, but it can also be frustrating at times. So Fran has got a question in the chat which is specifically about oral history, but I think in general about this way of doing kind of two-way research with contemporary religious communities about their histories. And she asked, do the speakers present their research to the community groups? Can this move the story on in terms of you sharing your research with that community? She says she likes this co-creating ideas. So yeah, I don't know who'd like to kind of respond to that.
I'm happy to have a go. I think if you're able to, if there is an interest, which you might very well find there will be, I think it's great to present your research to a particular church, to a particular congregation. A helpful thing in terms of, and it is a two-way thing. It's a mutual learning. You're able to, I don't know, kind of contribute to the sense of the historical identity of a particular group, but also you will, in the feedback that you receive in a session, you will learn an awful lot as well, and that will move your research on. I remember doing, I think it was during Black History Month, presenting some research to the New Testament Church of God, and that was a really kind of, I think, helpful exchange for the researcher and for the group. I've done another project with a group of charismatic churches, and these were not actually global majority evangelical churches, but still quite kind of charismatic churches. And one of the things that I've done with them was witness seminars. So that is where, and you can just do this online via Zoom or Teams or whatever, where you might present a bit of research, but actually the whole point of the seminar really is to get people talking, reminiscing, kind of bouncing memories off each other, and that will create a conversation. And if you're able to record them, then that can be really helpful to your research. And you might even find that you're able to kind of build up a body of recordings that, in cooperation with that group, they might want to keep, maybe put online. So there are all kinds of things that you can do when you have that kind of co-creating mentality. I think that there's lots that can be done.
Thank you, John. Anybody else want to kind of contribute to that? Dan?
Yeah, I have some relevant experience here, which is kind of interesting to throw into the mix. So the group I actually tend to specialise in are French Protestant migrants to the UK in the early modern period. And I've worked with quite extensively with sort of Huguenot memorial communities here. It's kind of really interesting to hear about this idea of co-creation. Because I was certainly going to say, like, in my experience, I kind of noticed this kind of, I mean, I've sort of held these events where we've kind of discussed refugee stories together, which have been very rewarding. It's been quite striking to kind of see the disconnect in some ways between myself as a researcher and my own agenda and that of the actual religious group. So in many senses, in historiography, there's kind of a tendency which is quite critical of sort of mythologizing. And it's interesting as a researcher to kind of feel like you kind of are part of this memorial sort of recreation, but also you kind of come with your own axis to grind, and like trying to get the right balance is something I've certainly found tricky. But I think sort of going down the route of something like co-creation is a really good way of sort of trying to navigate some of those questions. Because in a sense, as researchers too, we are participants in this memorial endeavor. So it's really stimulating to hear how others have kind of experienced and engaged with such things.
And I suppose that's all the more kind of difficult or interesting to negotiate, isn't it, when you're a person living in the place that you're studying, or you are a member of the community that you're sort of studying. And Tony, I don't know whether you wanted to come in on that kind of point.
Yeah, I think two different perspectives. One, just, but this was not my own research, but it was sort of a project that I sort of came out of Manchester Jewish Museum, which came out of what was then Manchester Poly, Manchester Studies project, which sort of partly by accident did a very vast oral history project of 500, 600 people of East European Jewish origin. And this was from the 70s onwards. So very, very early, and captured voices that was soon going to be lost. I went to a session where two of the key people involved, Bill Williams and Ross Livshin, were talking about their oral histories and approaches. And I think this is sort of an empowering aspect to it, that Bill was saying, or rather, he was aware that he was being told more. His background was Welsh Catholic, which essentially because he wasn't Jewish and he was male. Female people being interviewed were willing to tell him things that they assumed he didn't know. Now, he was very knowledgeable, but, for example, mikvahs, those are ritual baths that women would go to once a month, very Orthodox women. So Bill going in, they would just tell him all of the, this very spiritual, meaningful process, and they would assume he didn't know anything about it. Rosicrucian Orthodox Jewish woman, they said, well, you know what it's all about. So I think going in as an outsider can actually be quite beneficial at times, because we have a moment I'm co-supervising someone of Afghan refugee origin, and she's finding when she's interviewing people of Afghan refugee origin, they say, well, and we're having to sort of work with how do we get out of the thing, because she wants to know about the details that they both assume she knows, and how they describe it. So that's I think all very positive. Where I think this sort of partly relates to Dan's comment is that sometimes there can be tensions. That with co-curation, wonderful possibility, but there can be tensions. So if I go to talk to a Jewish group of East European origin, I can almost guarantee that they all have the same myths of origin, that they came escaping pogroms at the turn of the century and they arrived in England or Britain by accident. And we can sort of unpick that, and not being sort of clever clogs and saying, well, you're wrong, but but how do you then get into a dialogue where there's this very, very strong sort of intergenerational family stories of accidental arrival? We know that this was a very intelligent movement, that people came to the UK because it was cheaper, it was nearer, it was maybe transmigration or trans-step migration, but they did not come to England. There's stories of people arriving in Hull, which is where my family arrived, thinking it was New York. Well, they didn't. They weren't that stupid. That's where a cheaper ticket could be bought from. So how do you then deal with an audience that will not listen to you, will not sort of say, well, you think you know everything, or they'll tell you, oh, you arrived in Cardiff, even though we know that no immigrant boats arrived in Cardiff. So there are. What you then try and do is explore, why do you think this is the family memory of this is that there are areas, particularly say Lithuania, where there are very few organized violence against Jews. This was largely an economic migration with a sort of persecutory background to it. So it's sometimes we can have an idealized vision that we're all going in the same direction, but there can be, I think, constructive tensions, and that's the constructive, the tensions of oral history that are now valued. It's not just what people tell you, but it's also the silences. And that this is part of any life story, that any story we tell of ourselves is going to be with our own sort of mythology. And this is not to say it's wrong, it's just how we tell our stories to ourselves. And that can be tricky to coordinate, to communicate. So it's not that that we avoid it at all. It's just that something that we have to take on board, and that when it comes to sort of producing exhibitions and booklets or whatever, that can actually start to get to be a little bit more critical, because you can't have both. Well, this happened, but it didn't happen. That's not going to be a very convincing narrative in the public space.
Thank you, Tony. That's really, really helpful. Karen, do you have any kind of experience of having communities in the archive and their response to what's in the archive?
Yes, I mean, possibly not Jewish. I mean, we have vast child refugee material, and we work very closely with various organisations relating to that. And we have also done oral history projects based on that. I think that, yes, I mean, there's the pros and cons of the co-curation. I mean, we in conjunction with the organisation, we did a lottery funded project undertaking an oral history project, gathering together their memories. And I think it does sort of highlight some of Tony's points about people have particular narratives that come out, which, many of them are true, but there are certain sort of ideas that have perpetuated. And one of the ways that you have to sort of deal with that is try and go in with sort of neutral questions to try and get people to talk, but not go off onto sort of narratives that possibly are not helpful is maybe not the right way of putting it, but that sort of perpetuate certain untruths, shall we say. So yeah, it's been very interesting working together with that community and undertaking that, seeing their responses to some of the work that we've done there. I don't know whether that really answers your question or not, really.
Yes, it does. And sort of carrying on with this theme, there's a question in the chat about this process of co-production, and then when it gets to the kind of final report or the output, and I suppose the curating that gets done by the organisation themselves, and asking for certain parts to be removed or certain parts to be included or highlighted, particularly around potentially controversial issues like mother and baby homes, as mentioned in the chat. I just wondered if you have any experience of that kind of process of organisations trying to curate their stories and how you've engaged with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's often the case that you will have discussions with people being interviewed, and they will agree to sign, they will sign copyright and permissions to make their oral histories available. But there can be cases where there is a realization that there may be something within an interview that either is, well, sensitive, or it could be people, I mean, it could be with conversations with another project I've been involved in, where people are actually being rather rude or disrespectful about former colleagues or others, and whether that's the sort of thing that's appropriate to make available immediately. So there sometimes has to be a little bit of realization that may need redacting, but obviously that's something you will be very open about, and it may be the case that there's a slightly edited version that's made available immediately to create an accessible version for research, with the idea that a fuller version can be made available at a later date when it's appropriate. But I think that's partly archival curation undertaking sort of considerations of GDPR and other things as well. So it's just translating it into a sort of slightly different forum, I suppose.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to come in on this, John?
Yeah, I think it's really important to have kind of robust ethical arrangements in place if you're doing oral histories. I would start probably with the Oral History Association, OHA. I think it's Oral History Association. They have all kinds of resources online that can talk to you about kind of consent forms and and all the kind of issues around that. I think as well, looking at if you're looking at global majority evangelical churches, sometimes with oral history interviews, you might find that you're talking about potentially some quite difficult issues. It might be that you're talking about experiences of racial prejudice, for example. It might be that you are talking about kind of hard, difficult stories around migration. So again, there's a whole kind of ethical questions around there you need to be really careful to deal with, and just making sure that you're kind of respecting the person that you're interviewing. And then I think in terms of kind of that is another kind of tension, I suppose, with co-creation or co-curation, is kind of depending on the outputs. Like it might, if you're kind of preparing a kind of a research paper of some kind, then you need to be quite clear about that. You need to be quite transparent about the process that you're going to be going through, and that you, depending on the output, you will kind of have the final say really on what's going to go in it and what isn't going to go in it. In the context of all those kind of ethical arrangements you have in place. So you can't kind of be promising that you're going to be telling someone's story necessarily exactly as they would want it to be told. There will be things that you might include, might not include. It's going to be in proper context and all of that. So kind of being really transparent with the people that you're working with is important.
Thank you, John. That's all really useful information. And the Oral History Society run some training sessions in collaboration with the Institute for Historical Research. So you can find training sessions like today's session online to join if that's something that you'd find interesting. Tony or Dan, anything that you'd like to add on this?
Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
Tony.
Just, I suppose this is sort of because I've been working on it for some time and it's come to conclusion, but just I would argue for an inclusive history with difficult histories of migrant origin groups, religious minorities. That I've just finished a study of a Jewish triple murderer from 18th century Sussex. So it's sort of some time ago. I think it's not like someone's going to say, well, it happened yesterday and it's very bad. But we had a couple of years ago, we helped a local African Caribbean group, which was embarking on a very early oral history, which was successfully delivered. It is now being digitized by the British Library, and it's great because it is quite early. It was done from the sort of early 80s, and many of the oral history projects came a bit later. When we were talking to the group, and we're sort of, some of it was sort of technical stuff about things like ethical clearance and copyright and practical things. But we were also talking about the scope of the interviews and who was going to be chosen. So I sort of naughtily sort of said, would you interview someone that was the wrong side of the law? And the response was very understandable and very clear-cut. It was absolutely not. If we want to read about those people, all we've got to do is look at the local newspapers and local press, media, and so on. And my response to that was, well, you would get a particular perspective. You would not get the internal perspective. And at what we lack in, say, Jewish history, or say the early period, yes, we have stuff about Jewish crime. So in Manchester, the police museum have material, very racialized profiles of Jewish criminals, particularly those involved with prostitution. What we do not hear are the prostitutes' voices or the pimps or whatever. And that in any migrant community, those the wrong side of the law are going to have their space. So I would sort of plea for inclusive approaches, because I think they just make stories more human. So I'm not defending my triple murderer and saying he was a lovely guy. He clearly wasn't. Slit the throat of 3 people very badly, as it happened. But it's to understand the place of Jews in very early Georgian history. I think it's a great case study, because actually he was very integrated in the criminal fraternity. So I would argue for, if you're doing local community histories, that it's sort of warts and all. And rather than taking a risk, what that does is humanize communities. And rather than having them as sort of ethnic cheerleading, where you sort of have as many Mary Seacoles as possible, and ignoring some of the darker side of Mary Seacole and her sort of racialized view of very Black people, you approach it in a very critical manner and an open manner. And I think that's something that you can still do in community work. It takes a bit of nerve, but I think it ends up being a much more interesting story.
Thank you so much, Tony, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about this triple murderer at some point. Dan, what would you like to say?
Sure, yeah, no, to say, I mean, it kind of builds upon what Tony said there. And I mean, I thank him for his quite expansive reflections, but I think it offers me quite a lot to think about. Because I was going to say this, definitely in my sense, I'd highlight that these ethical considerations are really something to think about when you get involved with institutions outside your orbit, right? Like, these institutions kind of are looking for different things from your research. And I can certainly speak, for example, to one example I've had where I worked with an organization I won't name, but who essentially sought to sort of censor elements of my research because they felt it was essentially out of step with, shall we say, the church's view on queer experience. And these are things that can happen, right? And so I think really having a sort of active process of reflection of who you're engaging with and what you both want to get out of it, I think is important if you're ready to sort of engage communities in the most effective way, and also be true to your own sort of values as a researcher. Because those things, there is a confluence there, but you have to work to get it, I think. And kind of a lot of sort of talking to each other and trying to generate understanding of where each other's coming from is an important part of the process.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you so much to Tony and John and Karen and to Hugh, who's had to go to another meeting. But thank you so much for all of your contributions today, and thank you to everybody for your questions and comments in the chat. Do make sure that you look at the comments in the chat, because there's loads of extra tips in there about how to do this kind of place-based research into religious communities.